Welcome everyone. My name is Olga Mikheeva. I'm a Marie Curie fellow, research fellow at IIPP, working on patient finance, public banks. And it's our utmost pleasure to host the seminar today, the first in this term, and it's New Year, with my colleague, Thomas Marois, presenting his most recent publication, his book on development banks. Let me introduce Thomas. Thomas is a senior research fellow in patient finance and banking at IIPP, joined at the end of last year. Dr. Marois is a political economist working on finance and development. He's also a research associate at the Municipal Services Project Kingston and also holds a senior lectureship in SOAS, University of London. He's the author of the book, States, Banks, and Crisis, Emerging Finance Capitals in Mexico and Turkey, 2012, also co-editor of recently published volume titled Public Banks and COVID-19, Combating the Pandemic with Public Finance at the end of last year. I think he will talk a little bit more about that shortly. And his most recent book titled Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization is published or is being published as we speak by Cambridge University Press. We cannot wait to hear more about this publication. And Thomas will be talking about it shortly. Before giving the floor to Thomas, let me also introduce the discussants that joined us tonight. Professor Judith Clifton, Professor and Founding Director of the Jean Monnet Chair of the EU Economic Policy for Business and Civil Society at the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences, University of Cantabria, and Principal Investigator of one of the largest projects to date on disruptive technologies in the public sector, financed by Horizon 2020. Her areas of expertise are public services, debt transformation, public banks, especially European Investment Bank, and most recently the role of these institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, let me also say just a few lines, just a few words about the format. I think all is set for a very lively discussion we will have tonight. Format-wise, Thomas will take some 30-40 minutes to present, after which Judith will have some 10 minutes or so to reflect and to present her comments on Thomas' work. And then perhaps to give some time for Thomas to also to respond to Judith's comments, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. And before I conclude this introductory note, technology-wise, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please feel free, all the participants, please feel free to write your question or comment to either Thomas or Judith there, or to raise your hand using that function also in the Zoom. Once you do that, either post a question or raise your hand, I will be able to notice that and then to make sure that you will be able to unmute yourself and actually say your question or comment out loud. I think that would be nice human touch to our seminar today. That's it from me. Please, Thomas, the floor is yours. Feel free to share the slides.
Great. Thank you very much, Olga. And I will share my slides in a moment. But I also want to just welcome everyone to this webinar on public banks and COVID-19, but also particularly to thank Olga for chairing and Judith for coming along. And I look forward to having a conversation among us and among the participants here. I think the question of public banks today and the responses to COVID-19, but also in terms of thinking forward to the urgent action we need in terms of climate change and addressing structural social inequalities worldwide, is really a conversation that we must have, is the role of public finance, the place of commanding public money for some sort of public purpose, and the ways in which that can be done and ways it should not be done. And really my work, not only in terms of this book, but more broadly, is really about having that conversation and discussing more openly, more broadly, more systematically the potential and the pitfalls of public banks in contemporary capitalism and ways in which it can be catalytic for positive progressive change. So with that, let me share my screen here.
Sorry, just a one note. We are recording this webinar, this seminar, just to make sure that everyone is aware.
Yes, and I presume we're going to be posting it online as well, and so you can always catch up on it later if you're unable to stay for the whole one, or share it among friends and family and to everyone in the world. Great. So as Olga mentioned, this webinar is on public banks at a time of COVID-19. I want to talk a little bit about opportunities, threats, and link it to questions of just transitions. Let me just get that there. The context, as we all know, is not a positive one. The time of COVID right now, numbers are something in the range of 110 million cases that people, not just cases, that have experienced COVID. Nearly 2.5 million people have died from it. Economists estimate that the impact has been somewhere in the range of 4.5% on global GDP, and some $10 trillion worth of lost GDP. Not that I'm necessarily a growth fanatic or anything like that, but just a sense of the impact that COVID has had. Importantly, ILO has estimated that 93% of workers in one way or another have experienced some form of workplace lockdown. That there's been about 9% loss in terms of working hours. That translates into somewhere in the range of around 260 million jobs have been lost in the wake of the emergence of the COVID-19 global pandemic. And that labor income has accumulated a loss of nearly $4.4 trillion over the last, 4.4% of GDP, or around $3.7 trillion of lost income for workers in particular. Stack that up against what Oxfam, on the other hand, has estimated that simply between March and December of last year, 2020, billionaires racked up, by contrast, another $3.9 trillion in accumulated wealth. So there's an enormous disparity between the impact on workers and those on wealthy of the wealthy. So just to premise all of this, not that anybody necessarily wants to hear more about the abominable impact of COVID, but we all know that it is a pandemic that is clearly class divided in terms of its impact, very racialized in terms of the disproportionate impact on racialized minority communities, and also gendered. And we need to keep this in mind as a sort of that it's worsened already existing structural inequalities, forms of exploitation within the sort of context of capitalist social reproduction. On top of all that, it's done very little, if anything, to help stem the ecological crisis, which in many ways was the foundation of the crisis itself. And so this is the context we have to think about building forward better and doing things better. And that was very much the sort of context for this book. It was written basically between May and October, November of last year. It was very much a rapid response. And it was conceived of with myself and my co-editors, Dave McDonald, Municipal Services Project in Kingston, Canada, and Diana Barraclough at Senior Economist at UNCTAD, that there was some need for a reflection, some discussion of the role of public banks and what they've been playing in terms of COVID-19. And so we got together, we discussed it, we found some producers, and so it's co-produced also with the help of Eurodad, with UNCTAD Municipal Services Project. And we explicitly made it open access. So it was a labor of love, not one of any kind of financial return, that's for sure on our part. And so you'll have to forgive some of the typos and the odd sort of formatting error in it. But it's very much something to, again, as I began this seminar, a discussion of having a discussion, sort of putting something out there. its focus is much more on national, subnational, or regional public banks. We do have discussion there, central banks, and there are some more multilateral discussions, but we really wanted to sort of pull out the role and focus, disproportionately on national or regional public banks. And the clear message, the predominant message, and I'm going to get into some of the promising lessons of it, but the message is that public banks have not been idle. And for many, this is perhaps a surprising message. Public banks have not been idle, but many people have thought after 40 years of neoliberalism that public banks had disappeared, or have been, their capacity to intervene in the economy has been so muted or negated that they're really no significance. And it's actually quite the opposite that what we see. And so building on my other research in terms of the book that Olga mentioned on public banks, research there, it's quite clear that public banks are anything but muted and idle. There remain over 900 public banks or public financial institutions globally. They have combined assets of at least 49 trillion. And I can discuss the ways in which we measure that and so on, but combined at least 49 trillion in assets. They also have an important legacy of institutional legacy, of accumulated expertise and knowledge built into these institutions that they've developed over decades in some cases. And that these banks persist, and they persist since the 1500s. The first sort of municipal public banks, older forms of public-like banks go back millennia. But in terms of modern, contemporary sort of banking institutions, they began in the 1500s and they persisted today, but they're in many ways resurgent. And so we're seeing many, many new public banks being formed worldwide. And so even the data that I was looking at from my book, you can see that in 2018, at a measure of 50% ownership, 50% plus public ownership, and I offer a more qualitative definition of public banks as well. But quantitatively, dominant ownership, there was 808 in 2018, and by 2020, there's 910, just at a pure ownership level, coming to around $49 trillion in assets, which is about 17% of all banks, public and private combined. So significant. And that in turn then equates to about 34% of global GDP. So anything, in a sense, but disappeared. They remain powerful institutions globally. They also come in many institutional forms. So there are commercial retail public banks, there are development banks that don't take deposits, whereas retail ones do. And then there's universal public banks that combine developmental and retail. In fact, in terms of the dominant form, 57% of public bank assets are in the commercial retail banks. And so there's kind of an important sector that we haven't been discussing very much. So the focus has largely been on development banks. One message that I want to sort of keep in mind is that, and it's the message of my work in general, is that while these are public banks and they're owned publicly and they sit within the public sphere, they remain contested institutions. And so simply because something is public does not necessarily make it a good institution or an institution that works in the public interest or for any public good in general, right? So they're contested, and this is an important sort of methodological, theoretical point to keep in mind as we continue. So in terms of the book then, and I'm not going to go chapter by chapter. I think that would be unproductive and probably bore many of us trying to read out the specific examples from each different chapter, these 22 different chapters in the book. But we condensed and went through the chapters and tried to think of, well, what are some of the promising lessons? There are some negative ones as well, but what are some of the promising lessons of the research that many contributors spent their time freely to give us and produce excellent chapters for us? And what can we say about that? in the context of a global pandemic and a sudden stop in the economy. And what we kind of came out of that is that clearly public banks had a capacity to respond rapidly. So, as a matter of policy or political decision or institutional capacity, the pandemic hit, they got together, they started, and we'll talk about some of the programs in the next slide, they're lending out money, distributing liquidity, intervening in the economy. And that was among the strongest messages that came out within the chapters. Second main message, or promising lesson message, however you want to put it, is that when the banks had a clear public purpose mandate, that in the context of the crisis and a public health emergency, they were able to really react credibly to that, and often with very explicit and very clear and evident public bank backing, political and public backing. So they were able to react to their public purpose mandate, function in that line with the backing of government and, in many cases, society. So the mandate mattered in terms of how they were responding. And some of the examples I'll touch on later, where that public purpose is not necessarily written into the bank, where their mandates could be things like maximizing profits or ensuring efficiency targets or competitiveness. You see a disjuncture there between their capacity to respond rapidly and effectively to the crisis. In many cases, then the responses were bold, generous, and crisis-facing action. So in particular, I'll talk about the case of KfW in a second here, but that they really sort of unleashed the floodgates and began pumping money into health sectors, into general government support, into paying healthcare wages, and a lot of specific examples, putting money into things like proper water and sanitation and so on. So there's bold, fast, and significant outlay of resources in most of the cases in terms of the promising examples. And that the other lesson that doesn't necessarily come out in terms of their actual COVID response, but a lesson that we have to learn nonetheless is that any kind of response, bold, generous, crisis-facing, rapid, and public purpose is impossible without actually having existing banks in working and functioning within your society, and without having that institutional capacity built into them and historical legacy. And so where there is a sort of cultural legacy and strong working relationships within banks and with governments, this was actually quite a strong and important lesson to be learned, that it can't just happen overnight. You can't just create that bank and have it react the next day. And finally, there was a number of cases, and it's important to pull these out because they're so rarely highlighted within the literature, where there was a lot of benefits to the non-competitive forms of public solidarity. On the one hand, there certainly needs to be a lot of research done here in terms of the relations between public banks and other public sector services and institutions, public institutions. But what we also see is that there was a lot of, for example, cross-funding between public pension funds, central banks, and coordination in particular, regulatory coordination, other sort of multilateral institutions. At the EU level, you can see the relaxation of competition restrictions and so on. But you get sort of interlinking of crisis-facing responses, including between public banks, so northern banks lending to southern public banks, or even coordination at the level of EU between banks like KfW, ICO, EIB, and so on, coordinating generalized responses with the EU at a sort of multilateral institutional level. And so there's and then it's in a non-competitive setting. It's not to create more profits, but to respond to a crisis. And in many cases, this is all, they're generating quite a bit of loss for these public institutions, for these public banks, a point, again, I'll return to later on. The types then of actions or responses are fairly diverse and broad, but first and foremost, the main, let's say, response of public banks and how they understood their role was providing liquidity. And so when we talk about public banks at a time of COVID-19, the metaphor there is often and is often about their capacity to create time, to lend now, to give businesses, governments, peoples, families, students time to breathe, which was one expression, which is one of the more problematic ones, but the expression is correct in Turkey. Just the sort of, one of the programs was called the Nefes, the breath program, time to breathe, right? And this is a message that cut across most of the responses and the interviews that I've done with various public banks, institutions, and so on. It's just giving time to breathe. But also, then you see, and that can take the form of lending, subsidized lending, aggressive lending, fast lending, grants, regulatory changes to relax rules and to support further lending and so on. But it also takes the form of advisory services. So there was a lot of support given to clients, to governments in terms of debt restructuring, of provisioning of sector-specific expertise, health, water, education, and so on. And a lot of, a fair number of programs sort of across the board, from China to Europe to the United States, a lot of support for students in terms of delaying student loans, repayments, giving them more time, providing additional support to students, and so on. So a lot of social and equity-oriented services sort of coming out of it in ways that are qualitative and quantitatively distinct from what the private sector was doing. So these are, I mean, there's a whole long table and list of these. I encourage you to, you can go to the introductory chapter of the book. Everything's free to download on the website that's provided at the beginning, and I'm happy to share these slides for anyone who wants them afterwards. So, quite a number of actions and responses to the crisis, flowing from the 5 promising lessons. But no doubt that these are uneven, that not all public banks did this, and that in the cases where there was a strong public purpose mandate, that those connections and let's say the more pro-public or solidarity-based lending was far stronger than in those banks that were lacking that clear public purpose mandate. And so there's certainly room in all cases, but certainly room where these banks could be made better. And when I talk about making something better, this is going to link to a theoretical point I'm going to touch on in a couple of slides. I want to just, it's always sort of one case that people point out to. It's one of the better banks, certainly, the German Development Bank, or what the promotional bank in year terms, promotional policy development, all sort of thing. It's a sort of national, large scale bank in Germany that really sort of led the way in terms of the country's COVID response, both at home and abroad. And that's the chapter, a particular chapter that I contributed to the book. And there's a lot of work and examples within the KfW response that touches on the work that we do at IIPP in terms of our Puffin research project, in terms of priming public sector financial institutions for green innovation. And in terms of the KfW is interesting for its attempt and its thinking around trying to connect its COVID response to green transitions. And in some cases, it was stronger and weaker in the development bank. They explicitly pitched a number of its response programs to providing emergency response, but at the same time trying to green it. It again is uneven. I think even within the KfW, they recognize that their priority at the time of crisis, in the immediate wake of the first wave, and even presently right now, it was about providing liquidity, it was about providing time. Ideally, they want to green that lending and put some form of green conditionalities on it. Their research departments have been doing quite a lot of work around conceptually. They have a One Health initiative around linking their continued lending programs with more green transitions, around providing for healthy communities, and so on. But it is very much a work in progress, and it's something where researchers, those of us concerned with green transition, have been caught up in the COVID-19 moment as well. We need to do a lot of work, both among ourselves, but also with these institutions, in terms of thinking how can we better marry this ongoing crisis of COVID, the crisis of COVID, with the crisis of climate change. And this is one of the sort of opportunities, but also threats that I'll sort of discuss on near the end of the presentation. But there's one quote that I cite in my chapter from the chair of the KfW boards. The slide there is on the Development Bank, which is one sort of corporate arm of the larger KfW bank. It's a smaller arm of it. The wider program of the KfW bank was absolutely enormous. It's lending, they promised lending up to 760, new lending up to 760 billion. To inject into the economy. The government itself injected another 100 billion into the KfW and gave it the mandate to lend without reserve, without end, as you know, basically lend as much as you need at the time of this crisis. It does not have a profit mandate. The KfW, on average, prior to COVID, only would profit about 0.3 to 0.4% return on assets, which in mainstream measures is an absolutely failed bank, but by any normal, sensible measure, the KfW does a lot of important development, green, social, and controversial lending too, in terms of some of its other programs. But in many ways, it is sort of one of the model banks that we look to. And importantly, so it's lending without limit, but also without a profit mandate. And the impact of that is that in the first half of 2020, it lost something in the range of 580 million euros, which again, if you're a private bank, that's going to put you out of business. If you're a public bank, in this context, with a strong public mandate, we have to take that into consideration and ask, has that money been spent well? But also, you know, what's the future of that bank? What kind of implications is this going to have? If we're supporting students, development, a lot of the 48% of commitments in Africa, the Middle East, much of that was around public health and public water provisioning, necessary inputs, right? And a lot of that was grants, you know. And so there's going to be some really serious questions that come up in the next few years in the wake of COVID. But the sort of quote here captures a lot of, in a sense, what the book is about. And the chair of the KfW writes, the banks in the KfW have prepared intensively for today. Never before have we been able to put a full program, this COVID program is writing in spring of 2020, together this quickly. The federal government will assume close to full liability, and the loan margins are extremely low, pointing to the fact profit is not the issue. We've worked together in sort of a public-public collaboration. It is a political collaboration, and the KfW is fully aware of this, as are people who work within the bank. So it's not a depoliticized bank. It is very much an actor of the government, and its governance structure is headed by the two chairs, are government ministers, with 35 other members of society. Right, so this is an important point here, that there are no public banks that are depoliticized. There are simply ones that are more and less democratic, more or less separated from society. And those are always going to be contested issues. And then what they started with, how putting together a full program this quickly, pointing to the fact that we need to have this capacity already existing in-house, right? And for it to be able to respond at times of crisis. So here's where things start to get a little bit fun. So public banks are subject to the pull of private interests, as they are to other interests as well. I'll talk about this in terms of the theory in a moment, but I'm leading into it, right? They're not neutral institutions. They exist within society. They exist within the confines of a financialized global capitalist world market. They exist within the competitive imperatives of all corporations seeking to survive in COVID, but outside of COVID to maximize returns. And they exist and have existed for decades within the structural sort of transition to and consolidation of neoliberalism and neoliberal logics around private sector efficiency, around narratives that democratization is naive, that we need to privatize public enterprise and state-owned enterprises because they've been captured and because the private sector, you know, whatever the problem is, be it economic, political, social, economic, ecological, the answer to that problem is to expose it to the market, to expose it to competitive imperatives. That's been the message of neoliberalism. And that any sort of formal recognition that's of the public interest is not only naive, which is the specific message of this book here by Barth, Caprio, and Levine, but it's also dangerous in many ways. It's a naive thought to think that we can act collectively and in the public interest, and that the only true expression is, you know, individuals knocking into each other and trying to maximize their own self-interest, hence take everything out of the public sector and stick it into private markets and expose it to competitive imperatives. This message has obviously since 2007 increasingly come under suspicion. And then with the signing of the recognition of the climate crisis and the signing of 2015 sustainable development ambitions in the context of public banks and public finance, and now with COVID, there's clearly a recognition that there's a substantial and important role for public banks and for public finance. What that role is going to be is still very much up for debate. Because over the last 30, 40 years, in the context of neoliberalism and the push for privatization, you see the creation or the evolution and of what I call the as-if public banks. And to the extent that the World Bank and the IMF and neoliberal advocates have suffered the continuation of public banks in the public sector, they've pushed for them to be corporatized or marketized, to act as if they're private profit-seeking entities. And in many countries, they've succeeded. This particular bank here is the original branch of Ziraat Bankası, the Ziraat Bank in Turkey, which is the agricultural bank created back in the 1880s, been around for over 150 years nearly. And in the context of the 2001 crisis, this bank then was made profit-seeking. Its mandate is to maximize profits. And that's very much in the neoliberal line, right? Make them as if they're private profit-seeking banks. Neoliberalized, captured by private interests, corporatized. Okay? And in many ways, this is the ideal of depoliticization, to separate public banks from any notion of the public good.
Thomas, a 5-minute notice.
Perfect, thank you. This then has worked its way into what others, Daniela Gabor and other friends and colleagues at SOAS have talked about the Wall Street consensus, or formally into the World Bank's maximizing finance for development strategy, or the IMF World Bank co-authored paper on the billions to trillions agenda. It's very much the basis of public-private partnerships. And that's essentially taking public banks and pushing them to align them to private sector interest or private sector needs, private investor needs, wrapping the private investments with public guarantees via public banks. Or in other words, they've been talking about the bending of public banks to the needs of private investors. You can talk about de-risking, you can talk a whole, the whole range of different ways in which they're discussing the continued use of public banks, with the main message being to ensure that private interests are met and that these banks remain public in name and public capital only, but not in purpose, that they socialize private risks and no more, and that any sort of pursuit of a collective or public interest, pro-public sort of orientation that is democratized and responds to societal needs, so on, remains very much not part of these public banks. So the point I'm trying to get at is that public banks remain very much contested institutions. They certainly have public interest and pro-public orientations. We can see that in the context of COVID-19. We can see it in a number of institutions around the world and in discussions with their managers and workers. Certainly there's a logic, an institutional logic to that, and a culture and an ethos that they're working within the public sphere and many in the public interest. But at the same time, these institutions exist within global neoliberalism and financialization. They're being pulled to support accumulation and the amassing of wealth in fewer and wealthier hands. So this is a theoretical point, but it has led to what I've called a dynamic theory of public banks. Now we have to understand them not as something fixed, according that simply for being public does not necessarily make them good. There's nothing essential to public banks. This particular book illustrates that. There are certainly problematic responses to in the cases of Brazil, in the case of Turkey, in the case of Mexico, a number of cases where the very problematic responses of the public banks. In other cases, really great responses, potentially very positive ones, right? So there is nothing essential to public, but it can be made so. And this is the point about social forces informing what a bank does, how it functions, its institutional functions, and that giving it a character, a meaning to being public. So they're evolving because they're socially contested. And that what we need to be focused on is not whether whether we get a public bank, but how we're going to shape the functions of that public bank to respond to the public interest, democratization, and so on. Okay. This is important because of the context of building forward better. That we can't simply say, well, great, we have another 100 public banks and great, they've amassed another, several $100 million in assets. We need to think about, this question of building forward better in response to COVID by sort of marrying what public banks can do and making them function in a much more systematic way to address the priorities of and the necessities of what we're looking for in terms of overcoming not only COVID, but the climate crisis. This is going to face resistance and threats as they build up non-performing assets, as public banks lose money doing what they ought to be doing in terms of responding to COVID. Neoliberal criticisms are going to emerge. There's going to be calls for depoliticizing public banks, for privatizing them, for having lost money at the times of crisis. And this is all going to impact our capacity to respond to the climate crisis. As on the one hand, public banks have accumulated a significant amount of new debts around COVID that are unlikely to be repaid. Many of them are going to have to be translated into grants, and that's fine. But then what's to be done with these non-performing loans? As we have to obviously increase our investments in green transitions, in essential public services, things like public water. So it's a ongoing and hot question. So let me wrap up here then and talk about then the pull, not only the private interest, but the need to pull public banks and public finance towards public purpose. And in many ways, this is a lot of the work that we do at IIPP, and Olga does, myself, my colleagues, Gemma and Martha within the sort of Puffin project. That's what's we need. The priorities when we're thinking of coming through and out of COVID towards the climate crisis, and if we want a green transition for people and planet that is also just, we need to be able to command democratically how these banks are going to be run. Otherwise, they are going to fall into the sort of Wall Street consensus. They are going to be bent to private interests, and which may or may not have any relationship at all to sort of essential public service provision and green transition. And so then we need to, in a sense, make the functions of the bank credible in terms of a pro-public orientation, crafting their mandates and missions towards the greatest priorities of overcoming, of addressing racialized injustice, gendered inequalities, the great inequalities of class-divided capitalism, and confronting the sort of massive crisis of the ecological crisis, which, unless we're thinking of it strategically and systematically, is going to end up reproducing the very same structural dynamics that caused the crisis in the first place, in terms of inequality, in terms of private finance driving very dirty investments, and so on. So in terms of that, I think the question of the governing missions that we talk a lot about IIPP around linking finance to engagement with citizens meaningfully, and about building up and amassing real capacity within the public sector to be able to sort of catalyze and command change for people and planet is very necessary. Very, very necessary discussion we need to have. And to do that, we need to rethink these public banks, not as essentially good or essentially bad, but as things that can be made to respond to these societal grand challenges, if you will. And I will leave it at that. And I think I probably went a few minutes over, but sorry. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And we already started getting questions from the audience. But before opening the floor for Q&A, let me welcome Professor Judith Clifton with her reflections on Thomas' presentation.
Thanks very much. I won't talk much so that everybody has a chance to ask some questions. So first of all, thank you very much for actually inviting me to be part of the book. I actually think that this is the kind of future of academic work, isn't it? That we actually get things out in a crisis like this fast, free, perhaps with some editing slips, but the point is the research is out there quickly on time, because obviously most academic research comes out too late, for it to actually be useful. So this is great to see this approach, especially right now when we need it more than ever. So, of course, it's very interesting that we're all talking about public banks and public enterprises, actually. We've got a kind of some kind of golden age. The IMF is publishing at the moment on SOEs and COVID in general, SOEs including public banks. The World Bank is publishing Rethinking SOEs, and I'm involved in that, which is quite strange that they've invited me to be involved, actually. And we have new books coming out on regional development banks. So it's really in the public eye, all of this publicness, whether it's banks or whether it's public enterprises. And we're only at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is not maybe what we would expect after all of these decades of privatization. But of course, maybe what's been happening is that some governments have been privatizing, and at the same time they've been creating public enterprises. And so the talk was looking at one side and not necessarily noticing that we're doing one thing on the one hand, but we're actually doing something else on the other hand. And this is where we are now. So, when we look at all of this, this is just one or two things to push the debate further, I think. The basic question, why public enterprises exist? Well, we might not need to even ask that question right now in the middle of COVID. Sometimes we find it hard to explain to students why public enterprises exist, why public banks actually have to exist. And now we don't, because we all see the problems in our families, in our houses, in everywhere. So but on the other hand, we still have a dominant economic logic that we only need these things in times of crisis. We only need these things when markets fail. We still have, and I'm working with the World Bank on this, I still have this basic, very narrow idea that there's only certain situations that we need public enterprises and public banks at all. On the other hand, we can see patently that we need public money, public finance and public services to help us move out of this crisis. So, you know, people talk about publicness, they talk about public purpose. I talk about public mission. It doesn't really matter as long as we know what we're talking about. So once we have this idea about what a public mission is, I think it has to have different dimensions, not just the financial dimension in terms of profits, as Thomas was saying. We need to have environmental, ecological, social, political, all kinds of different dimensions. But once we've decided what a public mission is, in a general way, not just for one bank, in general, what would a public mission look like? We can use this as a framework to actually take to all the public enterprises and public banks to ask, actually, how well are you performing? Because one of the things Thomas has said today is he's talked about the positive elements of the public banks, and then he said they might be tempted or pushed down the road of private. But just to go into more detail, how well have all these individual public banks actually performed? How do we know? How can we measure? This is where I think we have to try and go. So how will we know? Will we compare a public bank in one country with a private bank in the same country to see how they behave vis-a-vis COVID? Or would it make more sense to compare public banks across different economies, different countries, to see in similar institutional backgrounds how well one bank's done compared to another? And how can we do this and how can we measure it? I think if we have an axis across and an axis up, the axis this is going up, we can have different dimensions on this framework. How well have they done financially? How well have they done economically, socially, technologically, ecologically on this axis? And on this axis, we can see public and private, or shades of grey, let's say, 100% public, 100% private, like Thomas was saying, corporatization, how autonomous is the bank, how democratic is the bank on the axis across, on the horizontal axis across. And then we can start to plot on this framework, what is the performance of the public banks? Because some public banks perform very well, and Thomas gave the example of Germany, but he's also hinted some public banks have behaved not so well and have not really put the public mission into place. I'd like to think that banks and public enterprises today who've started to use a common vocabulary, I think I saw this in your presentation today or somewhere recently, Thomas, was the Sustainability Development Goals. Now, if all public and private corporations and banks start to use this common language, which they are starting to in many countries, to some extent we think, great, we can actually take the common objectives they're using in the Sustainable Development Goals and actually compare how well they do. Unfortunately, I've tried to start to do that, and it's really, really difficult because companies can say, oh, you know, gender, and then they can give you something they've done in terms of gender, but it might not really be an advance. It might actually be a very profitable thing that they've done. It just, it's, let's say, window dressing use of Sustainable Development Goals. So it's very interesting that we're starting to see a global use of these terms, but it actually is quite difficult to use them to actually measure. So more or less to go back to where I started, I think one of the things Thomas said that was very important as well is it's not important just to say, oh, you know, this is a public bank, but, you know, what is the public mission and is it clear and is it relevant? Has it been updated? Okay, because, you know, one of the things the OECD says a lot is, you know, there's no point having a contradictory public mission that really is saying different things and it's impossible to put into practice, because if you do one of the things, you're not doing the other. So it's to go back as well to look at the public mission and make sure it's clear, relevant and up to date, and then to really think how we can start to measure and compare this. So, you know, in a way I wanted to extend a bit the things Thomas said in terms of creating perhaps a research agenda, even across public banks and SOEs together, to think about ways of actually comparing, and it's extremely difficult. And then really one question that I might just throw in, because I can see there's 2 or 3 questions coming up on the chat. In the case of SOEs, why is the World Bank looking at them? Well, I think China and Asia is one of the big reasons that they're wanting to see public finance SOEs. To what extent is what's happening in Asia, what's happening in China in terms of public banking and public SOEs, let's call them SOEs, to what extent is that driving the institutions to want to know what's going on? And I can just finally say, all the theory of public mission, why we need SOEs, needs to be rewritten to some extent for some of the new Asians, especially the Chinese, because they don't necessarily fit in to the Western economic reasons that we would establish SOEs. So this is another twist in the difficulty of trying to understand what we're talking about when we're starting to see new actors, when re-emerging rather than new actors re-emerging with perhaps different logics around public missions. I think that's enough from me, so thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Judith. Thomas, would you like to take some time to reflect on Judith's comments or research agenda or anything else that you mentioned?
Sure, I'll just take a couple minutes so that, because I think probably, I mean, some of the questions might overlap or there'll be some convergence there. But I think the question of how do we measure public institutions or state-owned enterprises' success is really important, because, right, this is the revolutionary element of neoliberalism, right? They've made us think that everything public ought to be measured as private, and if it doesn't measure up to some sort of private success level, then it ought to be privatized, because we should measure everything on profitability, efficiency, and so on. But it's, you're really comparing 2 very different things. And, I think Judith is doing some interesting work here. I'm looking forward to reading it. The Municipal Services Project has certainly been doing a lot of work around this in terms of reconsidering the sort of normative orientations of what essential public services should be looking at. And there is a lot of concern now for what really are the key performance indicators, or how do we measure the success of public banks and public services if it isn't what the neoliberals tell us to be. And we have to do a lot of thinking around this. And this is, it's, for one, clearly it's not profitability. And on the second hand, clearly it should be about what it's doing for society, linking to the question, why do we need state-owned enterprises or public services, right? It's because they ought to be, and they should be made to respond to public priorities, interests, to respond to the needs of society, rather than merely, amassing more wealth in the hands of a few wealthy elite. And while I'm still sort of learning about it and so on, but this is, I think, one of the important aspects, or certainly one of the things that interests me about working with IIPP and questions of missions, is that you open a dialogue and a discussion around what are our priorities in society, frame that as a measurable, identifiable, time-limited mission, say, providing equitable access to water to X amount of people or X communities in 5 years. You've got something measurable, you've got something, if that was the mission that you've sort of collectively agreed at, you've got something that's credible within society, and you can then measure the bank against that, and you have something by which you can share success stories around, right? And the problem has been, that doesn't fit within a sort of typically neoliberal narrative. So there is a research agenda that is desperately needed around creating alternative measures of how to look at the performance of public banks in particular. We've been doing this in terms of other enterprises and in other sectors, but the challenge have always been, those of us working on public banks, is that it is set in the sector, the most powerful fraction of capital right now, that, you know, has really dominated the agenda, everything from central bank independence and inflation targeting right down to microfinance, that it should all be about responding to market needs. And then public banks, you know, we're trying to sort of reclaim them and rethink them in ways that aren't, you know, well, let's say we're hitting some pretty strong barriers. So you see this, even like there's a number of, you know, public banks being 100 over last year, more or less, or not necessarily created new, but at least been taken more into public ownership. But in the creation of new public banks, they've committed to that in the UK, the new National Investment Bank, discussion of that in the US around National Investment Authority, arranged the Scottish National Investment Bank, right? How do we become more creative, more collective, more democratic, more ambitious, and certainly more bold in terms of setting measures and markers for these banks? For me, the key is really finding means to democratize them, substantive means of inclusion, and setting goals or missions or whatever you want, targets for these banks that are identifiable, that are socially credible, and that can be, you know, potentially hit or missed, but, you know, rather than whether responding to sort of profitability, are you responding to the other ones? And you know, there's an enormous amount of work there that needs to be done, and be that within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals or more bottom-up frameworks. You know, I think these are questions that have to be answered within society, within particular cultural and economic and political contexts, and that's fine. You know, it's the question of opening up that discussion and institutionalizing it.
Thanks, Thomas. Do you feel that we can go now to the questions from our audience? And I wonder, do you want to take them one by one, or would you like to take a few at a time?
I mean, I think we'll leave that to your discretion. If there's
All
one
right.
or two sort of overlap, and if I could, I would like to invite Judith to, you know, if we could, and yourself too, Olga. I mean, why not? And let's, you know, it is a discussion, right? I don't want to come across as a guy who knows all this about public banks. I don't, you know, I don't have all the answers. I've edited this book. I've written some stuff on public banks, but I know everybody here has done, you know, really important work in public services and public finance and so on. So let's please, if you have a point, you want to correct me on something or you want to add something.
Yeah, we have 5 questions. So I wonder, because I think participants already heard from you and Judith, and maybe we take a couple of questions first, and then we can, get this going. Well, first came from David Freiman, the PhD student of IIPP, and then Diogo. David, would you like to say it out loud? Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Thomas. My question was, what do you see as the key differences in the public banking response to COVID-19 vis-a-vis response to the global financial crisis in 2008? So.
Okay, and then Diogo. Diogo, please unmute yourself and feel free to, you're muted, but you can unmute yourself and read out your question. Diogo, can you hear us?
Yes,
Yeah.
hi, sorry. So Thomas, thank you for the presentation. I just wonder if you have any further comments on the change of role of the public development in Brazil, the recent changes, and how it can affect the economy.
Oh, I think you cut out there.
I can maybe read Diogo's question. As you can see in the chat. Diogo, I'm sorry, we cannot really, the line is not stable, but he says that, hi Thomas, very inspiring webinar. I'm from Brazil, and the question is, how do you see the recent change of role in BNDES, the Brazilian large state investment bank, to a more market profit-oriented public development bank? Thank you. Maybe shall we take these 2 questions first?
Sure. So sorry, David, your question, just to clarify, you wanted to know the key difference between public banks' responses to the 2008-2009 crisis and to COVID, or was it just in terms of
precisely, yeah, to the economic response to COVID-19, well, sort of differences in the mindset and the actual way they've gone about it?
I mean, it's a good question, and to be honest, I haven't thought about it all that much. To be frank, because there's such different beasts in a way. They are and they aren't. And this is totally off the top of my head here. I mean, in 2008, 2009, often the role in the banks that I've studied, largely I'm more of a development studies scholar. In more recent years, I've sort of branched globally. The function in 2008, 2009 was really about socializing losses. And in the context of neoliberalism, this is the huge problem, is that a lot of the private risk gone bad, accumulated through very speculative, financialized practices, would then get pushed onto public banks in one way or another, either through nationalization of the banks, the failed banks, and then brought into the public sphere, or in many cases, what the private banks did is stop lending, or only lending to their choicest clients, and then pushing all the high risk, high cost lending onto public banks, and then again another form of socialization, in that sort of very problematic way. Out of that, you get a whole range of different expressions, and this is one. This partly goes to leading on to what Diogo was asking about BNDES. I'm not an expert in BNDES, but in Brazil, but you get this kind of variegated responses to the crisis, and how, depending on the society in which these banks were either nationalized or made public or so on, you get sort of, they're made very differently. So in the case of the UK, the RBS was made very much into a corporatized, marketized public bank, but it was held within the public sphere, but it has no public purpose, and was only rescued, to sort of hold on to the bank at some future purpose. Versus other places within Europe, for example, you could, like in Belgium, Belfius sort of was rescued, and then it's taken on more public purpose. You get the evolution of Dexia within France and Belgium into a much more public-oriented public bank, like BPI France and other sort of versions of that linked to the Caisse de dépôt in France, that are quite aggressively sort of lending into the climate crisis and so on. So the point there, and again, linking it to Brazil, is that these are very dynamic institutions, and simply because something is public makes it neither good nor bad. And RBS is a public bank, but it acts as if it's a private profit-seeking bank. BNDES has had a very key role historically in Brazil in different forms through dictatorships and so on, been made in quite different ways, and sort of taken on a lead role in industrialization and domestic development and so on, often within very repressive labor regime, against labor regimes and so on. Now going with Bolsonaro, it's being pushed to one of these as if banks, right? So again, and a good deal there is probably a lack of sort of substantive democratization. And I think for me, the key thing with public banks is not that they act as if they're private profit-seeking bank, that we create different measures and methods and forms of governance and representation so that they can work within the public sphere, amass expertise and capital that can be commanded in the public interest, develop missions and mandates that respond to societal needs in substantive ways, binding ways, not just like, consultation, and creating neoliberalism was excellent at institutionalizing dissent, setting up all sorts of faux or fake consultation process by which they get all kinds of civil society energies put into meetings, but with no bite, right? These have to be built in law into the decisions of banks. And when they're not, that's the huge problem. And that's where you get these banks that are public in name only in their capital, but that function almost exclusively in the private interest. Judith, Olga, I would like to hear if you have any comments on that.
Judith.
Well, I've actually received a lovely question from Stephen Boxall, so I'm very excited to answer that one.
Oh, Stephen, yes. Would you like to read your question to everyone?
Yes, over the last couple of years, there's been numerous reports coming out of the IMF and the World Bank from what you might call the technical level, saying that the IMF and World Bank's policies have actually made matters worse. But they get ignored by the people at the head of the World Bank and IMF. So really, my question is, are the reports enough? And to make things change, do we need to change the people at the very top of these institutions?
So, I mean, I'd love to answer that one, but we're being recorded, of course, so I have to be, Stephen, and you and I can maybe have a conversation later on, more unrecorded. But of course, like in any organization, and just as Thomas was saying, public and private are not necessarily good and bad. The World Bank and the IMF and everything, there's so many different, let's call groups or factions inside them, aren't there? And they change all the time as well. Recruitment, countries get more power, the things we all know. And, there's been shifts to the right and not so many shifts to the left, let's say, of these institutions, and that of course affects what comes out of them. It's very difficult for me to give a quick answer to this, but all I can say is I believe in the conversation we're having, and I believe in academic rigorous work. So if we want to make agendas go in certain directions, it's up to us to do the hard work, find the frameworks, publish it, get the data, publish it out there, and show people that some things work and some things don't work. And I'm a scholar, and if my work ever influences policy, I'm over the moon. In a way, that's my answer to you, Stephen, today.
Olga, do you want to?
Yeah, I have a question, indeed. But I'm a bit conscious of my own role. I really would like to give most of the time to our audience. We have 3 more questions from Matthias, from Amy, Kenno, from Helen as well.
Okay, let me speak to Stephen's question a little quickly, and 2 before we. I'll make it quick, I promise.
Right, go ahead, please.
Because it's really important, and I mean, yeah. The IMF and the World Bank, they're multilateral institutions that have very unresponsive governance structures in many ways. And I don't know how many times I use this joke, but the World Bank is the world's largest self-hating state-owned bank, right? Like for decades, it's been advocating privatization. Sorry, Judith, I said it, you don't have to. But it is really, it's about, building new capacity. It's about reinvigorating, reclaiming the public sector and public ethos. And this is a long-term project. It's really about re-educating, rebuilding, reclaiming. And we're building from 40 years of neoliberal devastation in terms of, new public management stuff around the need to be as if you're private profit seeking. But there's the, IIPP, we're doing interesting, important work in this area. The transnational institutes, I've been working with them, and they've created a new sort of public sector management international program in Latin America right now about rethinking the role that public sector management, they can think outside the box. They don't have to be profit maximizing, entrepreneurs in terms of their logic of accumulating capital, right? So it's multifaceted, but it's really, it has to be a ground up response. And it really has to come within societies, and they have to make their banks and other institutions better. And there's no other alternative to it, in a sense. If I can't see any other way. It's not creating a new one, it's creating better ones.
Great. Okay, let's take further questions. Probably we have 4 we can take. Let me just jump in and just perhaps pose one question for Thomas and Judith, perhaps both of you. If we talk about rethinking, the public purpose of public banks, redesigning, repurposing them. And if, for example, from your empirical studies, I understand that, well, a lot of them are actually ready or eager to take on that more strategic public finance function. But then my question is whether, if so, whether do they have the analytical capacities, the methodologies for actually measuring, I don't want to use the word impact, but at least that strategic role. And if they're eager to, where do they think it should, come from? But let me also welcome Matthias. Sorry if I pronounced your name. Please unmute yourself. Would you like to ask a question, please? Don't forget to unmute yourself. There was a question about the BRICS Bank. We cannot hear you, but you can unmute yourself and read your question. All right, well, the question was about if the BRICS Bank changed its influence during the pandemic relatively to the traditional multilateral institutions, specifically IMF and the World Bank, and if yes, would you know what kind of projects and programs were financed? Would you like, or shall we take more? Just a second, we have also from Amy. Amy, would you like to ask a question yourself? Please don't forget to unmute yourself. Amy? Amy asked a question. Can you unmute yourself and repeat?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. I was just wondering, the KPIs, if you could do a global benchmarking through the use of, the Kate Rathworth donut instead of the Judith was talking about different indicators that you can actually do. I wonder if it was possible or useful. What do you think? Thank you.
Okay, let's take these three, and then we have Kenna and Helen later.
Who's going to, is it Thomas? Are you going to start or
Judith, you can start if you feel like.
Okay, well, I mean, thanks for the last question. I'll have to look her donut up to know whether I think it's a useful framework. So you're giving me some homework. Thank you, Emmy, for that. I know a little bit about it, but I haven't actually seriously considered it in this framework. So I will. Thanks for the idea. I'll let you know. And then what Olga was saying is, of course, one thing, the banks and the SOEs have their own, let's say, internal assessments of what they do, which they try to sometimes be more or less autonomous with that. I think the World Bank and the IMF has their own, external evaluation, which in a way is internal, but with some autonomy. But I think we're the ones who need to be doing this, in my opinion. So I think that's my answers to those two questions.
Okay, so I'll add on a little bit. Matthias, I'm sorry, I don't know. I haven't done. I was keeping an eye on the BRICS Bank for a while, but we didn't include it in the book, and I haven't done much on it at all. So I'm afraid I would really be grasping at straws if I tried to answer the question. So I don't know. Is the answer. And then the question, I mean, I think this question of measuring and how do we respond and rethink public banks, and which links to the KPI question as well. I'm sorry, I don't know the donut. It's really some key work, and I'm hoping to do some work around this with IIPP. My caution, though, when I'm thinking about KPIs, and a bit of a caution, maybe, and Judith, what you think about this, I'm slightly hesitant to have universal measures on this. Partly because I think the credibility of a public bank has to be measured domestically in the context of society in which it functions and ultimately to which it's responsible. And so I would hate to come up with universal measures. I think we can talk about fairly, not necessarily universal, but let's say more universal, normative orientations and so on. But when you were thinking about specific indicators it's going to vary quite a bit and from society to society. So I would rather say, I'd rather push for an orientation where there's a framework or structure set up by which you can determine what a public bank in a given society ought to be doing, which could be a mission, which would fall under a mandate around, could be linked to the SDGs, but need very more specific measures around that. It could be linked to questions of social equity. And one thing, and I'm very remiss for not even having brought this up so far, very clear indicators around gender equity. You could have indicators within the bank around representation and so on. And also, in different communities and different societies, key questions, key indicators are going to be around racial justice, about righting wrongs of the past, of colonial legacies, and so on. And those may or may not be transferable across societies. There might be some things that could be transferable, but I think these, and not to push a nationalism, that's not what I want to do here, but just to say that my view of public banks are they are expressions of class divided society, and in the first instance within those who own and control the bank. And that is always going to be a struggle in terms of what you define the success of that bank to be. So in Turkey, they've created these banks that used to have quite interesting social developmental missions in the past. And then with the crisis, they made them profit-oriented, profit-seeking, without any form of sort of representative democratic governance, and is really sort of driving those banks to the ground in many ways. But they can be made differently, given certain political context, but they have to be credible within that society.
Thank you. Another set of questions. Kenno, could you unmute yourself? You had a question about, the public banks are not obviously isolated.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Thomas. Very interesting presentation. With sort of the private banks very much still financing what Mariana Mazzucato calls FIRE, so financial institutions, insurance, and real estate. Do you think that public banks alone can be sort of enough to really build back better? Or does there need to be a more systemic approach that includes the entire banking sector? And if so, do you actually think that public banks can sort of pull private banks in that direction, or is there sort of a discrepancy between the two? Thank you.
Would you like to respond to this? I think it's quite big.
Sure, yeah. Where's my data sheet here? So, I mean, the short answer is probably public banks can't do it on their own, but they probably could too. So just to give you a sense, so when I'm talking about public banks and their $49 trillion in assets, those are ones that are 50% plus fully publicly controlled, under public control legally and by default. If you add in multilateral, that's excluding multilateral banks, that's excluding central banks. So if you add those in, and if you add in public pension funds, all at 50% plus public ownership, you're looking at $82 trillion in assets combined. If you take the measure, and I don't have them specifically right now, to a public controlling measure, so like 25% or more ownership, or you would still have essential effective control over the institution, you're looking over, you're nearing $100 trillion in assets in public control. I don't think it's necessarily that you have to do it all public, and I don't think right now politically that's possible. What I argue in my other book, my forthcoming book, Public Banks, with the subtitle Definancialization in there, is that really I think the strategic role for public banks is to definancialize the economy. So which very much thinking about the FIRE sector, very much working against the short-term, high return, profit maximization logic of private finance, is to essentially channel, to the extent they need them, public and private funds into public banks, and then slow those funds down. In a sense, you could call it patient finance, you can call it whatever you want, but also, so there will also be a spatial capacity to sort of, in David Harvey terms, create, fix globally mobile finance within a space for a given amount of time, definancialize the global economy. And to do that means amassing and building up more public capacity, not only financial, but also technical and democratic capacity within the public sphere that can then be commanded in the public interest with this sort of logic of, a public good or creating public value. There's different ways you can talk about it: pro-public, public interest, providing essential public services, green transition, whatever. But essentially, my argument, my view is that without this public capacity to definancialize the economy, there is going to be no effective green transition, and certainly not a just one. Whether they do it only with public funds, I'm not sure that is the most important question, but how they work with private, and in a way that would be very different from the World Bank agenda of bending public banks and public finance to private interests, or very different from the Wall Street consensus. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of my view on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Olga, have anything to add on that or not?
Judith, would you like to add anything there?
I think that was a great answer. I'd like Helen to have a chance to ask her question because she's got a good one. It might take her a while to reply to it.
Right, okay, let's take Helen's. Helen, can you unmute yourself and speak up? Hi. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations, as well as the forum for discussion you offer to all of us. Let's say my question is that it's interesting to look not only to the output of these public banks, but also the way they do it. And this is linked very much to what you both mentioned about the democratization, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's linked with risk, because we see that public needs surge, whereas public finances shrink. So the banks, they move very much to leverage. And the moment they move to leverage and to the financialization, the extreme financialization of the banking sector, then the more intransparent the whole thing gets. So the issue for me is to find ways also to see how these needs can be achieved, the public needs, without too much financialization of the finance sector. Because the moment the risk comes in, the whole thing becomes completely intransparent and nobody knows exactly what's going on. And I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Great question. Who would like?
Judith, do you want to speak to this at all?
Well, I wanted Helen to have the time to ask that question because it's kind of a big one. I mean, I'll just give a very quick reply, in a way, disclosure. It's actually quite difficult sometimes to work on public banks because not all public banks are very happy for researchers to work on them, even though they are public banks with public funding and public finance mechanisms. And without naming any, just not to, I think that working towards greater transparency, in a way I'm taking what Helen said and taking it in a slightly different direction, is extremely important. So as she's saying, certain kinds of loans are more difficult for people to understand, which is a general thing across the board. How transparent are public banks to researchers? But the other thing Helen's asking is whether public banks, in a way, who enter down very financialized tracks are inevitably going to become less transparent as regards their loans. And if they don't do it, can they actually do a good job? But I think, Thomas, I'll pass that to you, that one.
Thanks. Thank you. Ellen, this is a really very important question, very good question. You know, it's something we deal with a little bit in this book, but it's something I've talked about more in terms of the more public banks book, but also a lot of writing I've been doing the last couple of years, thinking sort of at a conceptual or like schematic level of what kind of public banks do we want, are we thinking about? And so I actually use your language in the same way, like the ways of lending. What ways of lending do we want and do we need to have a green and just transition? And it's such an important question, and Judith really hit on maybe the linchpin of it, or one of the key elements of that, and that's the question of transparency and the reticence of many public banks to provide clear, transparent information, and many of them have no form of sort of open and accountable governance mechanisms or boards who knows what they're doing or why they're doing what they're doing. By contrast, there are also, but at the same time, there are a lot of public banks that are, you know, really open and transparent, provide everything online, and you know, are quite willing to talk to us. And you know, again, I would be remiss if I didn't note the most democratized bank that I know of in the world, which is the Banco Popular de Desarrollo Comunal in Costa Rica, which has its highest governing board is a 290-member assembly of workers, working men and women. It's a worker-owned and controlled bank, but I still classify it as public because it's constituted in public law. Underneath that sits its governing board, which has 3 government members on it and 4 representatives of the Workers' Assembly. The Workers' Assembly is constituted by 10 different social sectors in Costa Rica. And then it also has like regional councils and so on. Besides that, it has a permanent women's commission by which the bank has to respond to specific gender goals, and they can review policies and mandates to make sure that, you know, they fit within sort of a perspective that it moves toward gender equality. The Workers' Assembly and the board by law must have gender equity. So in a 7-member board, it works in alternating years. It can have 4 men 1 year and 3 women the next, 4 women, and so on, back and forth. But by law, it must pursue that. So the point of that is that we can have really creative ways, and time is running short, isn't it? And
we have 2 more questions. Yeah, please.
Think about it. But the point is, yeah, it is only in that way that we can begin rethinking risk and the ways of lending that we're doing. And the key there being definancialization, about finding ways to slow rapid flows of global finance and pull it through public banks, through the public sphere, with some form of public purpose or value.
We have 2 more questions, and I invite Johnny or Yoni, I'm sorry if I pronounce incorrectly, and Robert. If you could, Johnny, first you, and then Robert, could unmute yourself, please, and just briefly, perhaps using 20-30 seconds to ask your questions. Johnny, unmute yourself, please. We cannot hear you. Unmute? No. Let me read it because the time is running short. So the question was about how can we use public banks for equity-based, intangible, co-reinvesting constellations or collaborations to encourage local or global digital innovation, intangible investments. I would leave it there. And Robert, can you unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Firstly, thank you very much for excellent discussion. Really good, very interesting. So my basic question was, when we compared the global financial crisis, to a large extent, the tab was picked up by the public sector governments across the world on behalf of the taxpayer. And similarly, I think, you know, obviously a lot of effort went into reform of the banks, making sure they were well capitalized to avoid that situation recurring. But once COVID came along, it was without question a situation whereby the public sector again had to pick up the tab. My concern is that the COVID crisis may prove to be, let's say, a minor foothill compared to the bigger challenge, which is the ecological and environmental crisis that we face in the world, which I think is extremely urgent. And my concern is that, and I guess the question for the participants is, my concern is to what extent do we think that the resources can be available, or where there is the willingness to make available the resources that will be required to face this very urgent challenge. Thank you very much.
Okay, brief answers, if possible, to these large questions.
Sure, and I'm sorry, Johnny's question was about encouraging local investments, how public banks can do that?
How can public banks encourage equity-based intangible, investing into digital, intangible and co-investing in order to encourage local digital innovation and intangible investments. So I think it was focused on that intangible infrastructure and innovation.
That's probably a discussion Johnny and I would have to have. I'm not quite clear if he means equity in terms of investment. This is always a problem with my friends in municipal service project. They say equity, they mean social equity. And I talk to my banking friends and they say equity, you mean like taking a stake in a local firm? So I mean, this is an important debate, particularly in the United States right now, in terms of the creation of public banks and their ability both to take equity stakes in local firms, especially in terms of cooperatives or saving failing firms in the context of COVID. But also, you know, many public banks are local banks, regional banks, city banks, and their whole purpose is around tailoring and developing expertise around their communities. So one example would be the Bank of North Dakota, a state level bank that's been around for 100 years. And it's very much around, you know, building the North Dakotan economy and tailoring its expertise and knowledge to farmers and sort of local industry, but also a lot of public sector and public service investment there. Many banks would have that similar type of focus. So again, it's about its mandate and its mission. Robert, in terms of the global financial crisis, absolutely right. They socialized it, pushed the costs on the taxpayers. We're still paying for it. And then not much happened in terms of reform the global financial system. COVID, I mean, this is a worry. I don't know how it's going to play out. The costs of COVID are going to be held in public banks. What's going to happen with that? What is going to be the political reaction? And what barriers does that accumulate debt? And this is what's coming from a lot of the sort of discussions I've had with public banks and bankers, that they've been accumulating this debt. They know they have to link this and think about this in terms of the immediate and ongoing ecological crisis, but their capacity is being, in a sense, partly undermined by having to respond to COVID and this buildup of debts within it. There's going to have to be a political response in one way or another, that the debts held within public banks are going to have to be written off, absorbed into the public sphere, the state. The question then is what the state's going to do with that. How are they going to deal with that in terms of, I mean, there's lots of debate on monetary theory, whether they can just create more money, whether, we're going to have to find new forms of taxation. My sense is that it's going to be taxation. That's what we ought to do. And in terms of we need a better, more equitable policy of redistribution. And then, re-gearing and building up and amassing capacity within public banks, and with the explicit mandate and mission to gearing that towards responding to the ecological crisis. So here I have a very specific position. I think public banks should be competing with private banks head on, and they should be amassing their own capacity. And really people should have a choice to put their money in a public bank rather than a private bank. Cities, states, government should have that choice. And then in that way, you also build an ethos that you can put your money in a green bank, in a public bank that's responding to some sort of public purpose, and that why can't I have a credit card from local public bank and my interest payments go towards building up equity and building up capacity in that bank? It's pure ideology that public banks ought not to compete with private banks. This is a big debate in the United States. I'm not American, but I'm engaged in the debate. And in most of the global South, public banks compete with private banks, and then that becomes part of their capital base. Why not? I mean, this is a way to respond. How you do it, the ways that you're led, the ways you're dealing with that risk, of course, as Helen brought up earlier, is very important. It has to be transparent, has to be accountable, has to have a very specific direction. And that direction, then the big struggle there is to have that done democratically and responsibly. There's a much bigger discussion that can be had around.
Right.
Excellent question. I know we're 5 minutes over.
Yes, we're 7 minutes over.
Passionately
And we have one more question from Peter Andreas, but I'm afraid we need to close. And I have saved that question, and perhaps Thomas, you could respond. Thank you very much, really, for all attendance. Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Judith, for being a discussant. Really was a wonderful Monday evening. Thanks a lot, and see you next at the next IIPP seminar.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Take care, everyone.